Lovely. Okay,
You're
over to you, Alex, and good enjoy everyone.
fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for joining this evening. As Susie said, um, I'm just looking through the comments as they're all coming in and the messages. So this is the first of a series of webinars with the Shifting Tides project. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with the Shifting Tides project, but if you aren't, we are a 2-year project which is being run under the Creative Climate Fund in Carlingford Lough. And we're using multiple lenses through science and the arts to learn about the Lough, understand it, and focusing on marine ecology. Um, through lenses of citizen science, the arts, and as many other forms of understanding that I suppose we can gather together over the next 2 years. It's a community-based project that's working with communities on both sides of the Lough, in a number of towns and villages, and we're going to be working both on the water, under the water, along the shores. So hopefully this series of webinars, which is going to be looking at a number of different habitat types, species groups, is going to be part of an inspiration for some of those creative processes, some of the sort of research processes that we go through in the next 2 years. To introduce myself, I'm Alex McMaster, and I'm the ecologist working on the project. And I'm from Donegal, but working down now on the Shifting Tides project in Carlingford Lough. A lot of my background has been as an ecologist has been in the Mediterranean. So I'll be talking about that a bit more tonight. And then I'll be handing over to Ed Sheldon and Tim Butter, who both have a lot more experience on the island of Ireland, working with seagrasses on our more local shores. So the purpose of tonight's event really is to introduce these wonderful meadows, these incredible ecosystems, which are really vital for supporting marine life around our shores. They're also carbon sinks. They draw down carbon into their root systems, and they protect our shorelines. And they're also species groups and habitat types that are threatened for a number of different reasons. So hopefully tonight we'll look at some of those, some of the specifics of seagrasses, some of the threats that face them, and some of the ways that people have been working to better understand them and protect them through a variety of different projects. So there are going to be 3 different species that we're speaking about tonight. Um, the first one that I'm going to speak more about is going to be Posidonia oceanica, because that's area that I'm more familiar with. This is known more commonly as Neptune grass, and we work with it. I work with it quite a bit in the Mediterranean. Whenever I hand over to Ed and Tim, we'll be looking at species that are more specific to Ireland and the British Isles. So we've got Zostera marina, which is known as the common eelgrass, and Zostera nolte, which is dwarf eelgrass. One of the differences that we're going to find that's between these different species is that the Posidonia that I work with mostly in the Mediterranean is in waters that are non-tidal, so they're pretty much always in the same sort of region of water in the water column, whereas the Zostera nolte and Zostera marina are more subject to tidal changes. So you can see in this picture of the dwarf eelgrass Zostera nolte on the right-hand side, and this is a photo that's taken when the tide's out. And so it makes it actually more open, I suppose, and accessible to people who are interested in doing citizen science on the foreshore. So let me see. A little introduction to seagrasses in general. Um, a very, very important distinction to make is that seagrasses are not seaweeds. So something that's very commonly, a mistake that's very commonly made is confusion between the two. And there are some really crucial differences. One of the major ones is that seagrasses are a group of flowering plants. So they reproduce through producing flowers. They can also reproduce clonally, so they can move outwards from one point where a plant is growing, a bit like how strawberries would in a way. Whenever you've ever had a strawberry plant that grows out sideways. They consist of quite an extensive root system, which is the bit that can be the most exciting because that's where the carbon is stored. If you think about seaweeds, they attach themselves onto a rock using a holdfast. They don't have actual root systems that go into the seabed, whereas seagrasses do. So they're able to root themselves deeply into the seabed, and that means whenever they photosynthesize, the carbon that they are capturing can be drawn down and stored in that root system. They consist of leaves, shoots, like any flowering plant, and then they produce flowers and seeds. In the Mediterranean, with the Posidonia species that I work with, the seeds it produces actually float to the surface, known as olives of the sea, and then they float along and they sink after some time. The packaging essentially around the seed degrades, and then acts as food for the seed itself whenever it plants in the seabed. So yeah, that's a little bit of a rough introduction. So I'm gonna go into more the work that I've been doing in Greece with seagrass meadows. This is mostly through an organization that I was involved with setting up a few years ago called COSAMAR, which is the Kefalonian Organization for the Study and Awareness of the Marine Environment. It's quite a mouthful, which is why we call it COSAMAR. And this is based on the Ionian island of Kefalonia, which is just off the west of Greece. Now, the Mediterranean seagrass, Posidonia oceanica, or Neptune grass, grows all around the Mediterranean shores. It grows from a depth range of about 5 meters to 30 or 40 meters deep. Um, and over the past 4 years or 5 years or so, we've been studying this seagrass and the impact, particularly of anchor damage on these seagrass meadows. So seagrasses have been, while they have a lot of significant functions and they have really important contributions to the marine ecosystems. I've mentioned carbon sequestration, but they also protect shorelines. They're also a real hive of life. They support a lot of biodiversity. They are a shelter for fish species. A lot of juvenile fish have their nurseries in seagrass meadows, which sounds quite adorable, and I promise you it is. We do a lot of our work also with fish species, and so we'll go and record the fish that you see in amongst the seagrass meadows. There are a lot of fish that hide in between, but you also get a lot of invertebrates, species that grow on the leaves in the root systems, and so we're really interested in studying these. However, the seagrass meadows that we work with are, it's very often the same case in Ireland, and Tim and Ed will be able to speak more to this. We have a lot of threats to these meadows through anchoring in particular. So a lot of boats are dropping anchors in the seagrass meadows, ripping them up. And this causes damage to the meadows, a lot of which grow over very long time periods. So it means that damage becomes relatively irreparable in a sense. The meadows that we're working with are growing very dense root systems. You can see in this image just how dense the meadow itself is. And those root systems can be growing layer upon layer upon layer, year upon year, and growing outwards and outwards and outwards. So some of the systems that we work with, the root system can be 2.5 meters high off the seabed. And they grow up, if you've ever seen a mangrove forest, they're growing in a very similar manner to mangrove forests, except on a much smaller scale. They then grow outwards as well. There have been systems that have been found that are several kilometers across and tens of thousands of years old. I think the oldest seagrass system in the Mediterranean is about 200,000 years old. And someone might be able to answer this for me because I can't spin it off the top of my head. But I think recently off the east coast of Australia, if anyone knows the number for it, they could drop it into the chat. Recently off the east coast of Australia, I think the oldest seagrass meadow in the world has been discovered. I think it was last year. And there was even discussion about it being the oldest organism ever discovered in the world. When we think about redwood forests and so on. This is quite incredible. Another thing, I guess, there's a lot of parallels that can be drawn with forests. When we think about that carbon sequestration, And we often think of rainforests and the power that rainforests have in absorbing carbon. When we look at these seagrass ecosystems, the ones that we work with in the Mediterranean, if you take a meter squared of seagrass meadow and you compare it to a meter squared of Amazon rainforest, we actually find that the carbon sequestration occurs at a much higher rate in the seagrass meadows than in the tropical rainforests. So this is another really incredible feature of these meadows. I hope I'm getting people excited about them now, because it can be difficult. I have a difficult job trying to get people enthused about grassy meadows. We often get the response that I would be better taking this presentation to a group of sea cows off the coast of Florida. So in Greece, with Cozumar, the work we've been doing has mostly involved scuba divers. So we're using methods of citizen science to understand these seagrass meadows. We have students who are coming to visit us for a couple of weeks of the year, and we're working with these meadows, with these students in these meadows, um, to carry out quite simple methods of study. We have divers that go down, they measure the coverage of the seagrass meadows. They measure, sorry, I'll just jump back. Yeah, just a message there. Could everyone just make sure their microphone's on mute? So we're measuring the coverage of seagrass meadows, and we're measuring that year on year on year to see the changes that come about if we have impacts from boat anchoring. There are also threats that come from dredging and anything really that damages the seafloor, coastal development. There are some threats that come from climate change. So these are things that we want to measure the changes with. We also want to set baseline data for our future studies, because there isn't a lot of information on the extent of seagrass meadows. There are a lot of organizations that are now going out and trying to understand what's going on with seagrass meadows, like with a lot of things in the sea. If you've been to our previous sessions on citizen science, you'll have seen why it is so important to have more and more people gathering information on the shoreline and under the shoreline, because there very often is a lack of information available. So this is where initiatives like ours in Greece and like the ones that Tim and Ed are going to talk about in a moment really come to the fore. So one method we're using divers underwater. That's relatively high tech in terms of having divers in the water, but once we have them down there, the actual methods of measuring seagrass extent are pretty simple. A more high-tech version that we use is we use drones to, and the drone in this image looks like a military drone, but we're using one of the very, very simple ones, the little ones with 4 propellers. And again, this looks very complex, but we're essentially flying a drone in a grid pattern over seagrass meadows. And we're very fortunate in that, working in the Mediterranean, we actually are able to see through the water and be able to see where those meadows are. So you can see in this bay where we're working, you've got the limestone island in the forest, and then you can see all the sandy patches and the seagrass meadows, which are the darker areas. And we use these images to get a broader view and a broader sense of the coverage of seagrass. Again, Ed and Tim might be able to speak to the challenges that are faced in less clear waters. But we really have this opportunity in the Mediterranean to be looking from the sky and get a really good idea. You can see that, you know, you have these dark patches. If we were go to a bay, this is a very sheltered bay where there's really good opportunities for boats to come in and anchor overnight. If we go to other bays where there's less anchoring, we very often see that it's a very dark, a much bigger dark patch. So this one is one where there is damage. We use these images actually as well, not only for our own studies, but also in outreach to boat users. And we use these images to demonstrate how you can see from the surface where there are seagrass patches and where there are sand patches, so that they can aim to drop their anchors in the sandy patches and prevent that kind of damage. So as well as surveying the seagrass meadows themselves, we look at the associated life that's linked with them. I mentioned the nurseries of fish. This is a school of young barracuda that I photographed last year, passing over a seagrass meadow. And so we have these fish nurseries. We have fish species that take shelter in the seagrass meadows. And we try and take a really integrated approach to the work we're doing so that we're recognizing the breadth of the ecosystem that is being supported by seagrass meadows, but also the livelihood impacts that has. And we have a lot of support from local fishermen in Greece who are interested in maintaining healthy seagrass meadows as essentially a source of fish that are coming out that they're then able to catch. So there are actually a lot of local small-scale fishers are really interested in us protecting areas to act as nurseries and protecting areas that are significant that fish are coming out from so that they have a sustainable yield of fish year after year after year. There's a whole issue around that, around preventing larger external trawlers coming in and then scooping up all those fish. And there's some conflict there between large and small scale fishers, but there is a lot of interest from smaller scale fishers in protecting these areas for their fish yields. Another example just of marine life that we find in these meadows, this is a spirograph, which is essentially a worm, which has these sort of feathery filaments that come up out of its casing, and they drift like this to feed on the water. And so they a bit like sponges and other creatures that I guess gather their food from the water. This is what the speargrass are doing, and they're absolutely beautiful, stunning creatures. As soon as you get too close to them, they suck down back into their casings. Another creature that we've been getting really interested in recently has been this particular species of bivalve mollusk, which is so it's a shellfish. If you were in Dave Wall's session 3 weeks ago over in Cranfield, he was talking all about bivalves, and these are our mussels, oysters, and other shellfish that are opening, essentially, like this one right in front of us. So we use these as indicator species of the health of seagrass meadows. So we actually had a predecessor to this shellfish. This one's called Pinna nobilis, or the spiny fan mussel. And the predecessor to the Pinna nobilis was called, sorry, the Pinna rudis was called Pinna nobilis, which was known as the noble pen shell. These shells were up to a meter in height, really, really enormous shells. And we find them within the seagrass meadows. They were an indicator of the health of seagrass meadows. If you had healthy seagrass meadows, you were going to have healthy pen shells. Just like if you have healthy seagrass meadows, we might expect to see more healthy fish populations. So unfortunately, in the past few years, a disease did spread across the Mediterranean and wipe out the majority of the larger noble pen shells. But in their place, we're starting to see these smaller species appearing. These guys are maybe just about the size of your hand. And so we've started measuring them, studying them, looking at how they grow. We often find them on the edge of seagrass meadows. And so they also are an indicator species for the health of the meadows. And this is quite significant for our research looking into healthy seagrass meadows. So the research that we do is quite small scale, and it's mostly located around a number of small bays. And the results that we come up with are showing us things like which bays have the healthiest seagrass meadows and how that correlates to boat activity. So we're actually looking at the boat activity in these bays. We're using drones to fly over and count the number of boats, or sending volunteers out on bicycles to count them in the evenings. And then we're correlating that with the health of the seagrass meadows, and we do see a really significant correlation. And this is just a specific threat for the Mediterranean. There are other threats that exist in the rest of Europe and in Ireland and the British Isles. Again, something that Ed and Tim might talk about in a moment. Dredging and so on can be risks to seagrass meadows on our own shores. Um, and there are measures that we're looking at taking to prevent this kind of damage. So one thing we're looking at doing, and it's been done elsewhere, it's been done in England as well, is installing permanent moorings, which boats can use so they don't have to drop anchor onto seagrass meadows. Um, that removes the threat of more damage, and then we can start looking at things like restoration of seagrass meadows, and that's something that we certainly want to move towards in Greece. There are projects that have already started having success in these kinds of initiatives. There's one in particular that I'll just speak briefly about, which is the Sea Wilding project in Craignish, Loch Craignish in Scotland. It's a community-led project that's where a community group got together and we're already doing work around their loch, and it's a sea loch, and they noticed the damage that was being done by trawlers and dredgers to their seagrass meadows and oyster beds, native oyster beds. So they started to carry out a restoration program in their loch, and they are growing up seedlings year on year of seagrass and native oysters, and then planting that. And it's a huge community initiative that's been really great, not only from an ecological perspective, but also from the perspective of getting people really engaged in the water and getting them in the water, snorkeling, planting seagrass, and finding out what's down there. So this is something that we've tried to do with Cosmar in Greece as well, is increase that kind of awareness. And we've done this through a few different methods, and one of which has been running outdoor exhibitions of underwater photography. The one here that I'm showing is quite a broad-reaching one. And we're about to run one that's specific to seagrass. So we've captured various different photographs of marine life. Where are my photographs of marine life? I was going to come on to them, but I've lost them. Sorry. Um, how do I come back, come back, come back? Yeah, various different photographs of marine life. And then we've also tried to broaden things out by inviting artists to come and respond to what is often quite a difficult ecosystem to communicate in an effective way so that people get really engaged and interested. So we've started looking at inviting artists to interpret these ecosystems and find imaginative ways of sharing them and communicating them with a wider audience of people who don't get underwater scuba diving or aren't able to go snorkeling and aren't able to see these incredible habitats. So one example is a film that we produced last year with a couple of free divers who were also dancers. And we shot this film underwater to, I guess, enliven the narrative around seagrass meadows and take a more creative approach. So we had dancers in the water. We also had people working on sculpture, and they were using pieces of seagrass roots that they were finding washed up on the shore, and creating weaving sculptures from them. And then we also had poetry and literature being created around these meadows. And this is something that's certainly important for this project just as much, is trying to find creative ways of interpreting the sea whether through scientific research methods or whether it be through artistic methods. And so that's kind of, I guess, where we're heading with Shifting Tides. So I think I've probably spoken quite enough about my own work. And I hope I've introduced seagrasses as a species group and topic that is interesting to everyone. I am going to then hand over, I think, to Tim to give us a bit of an introduction. Tim, if you're able to, are you able to share your screen? I hope I've stopped sharing. I think, Tim, are you able to share yours? Brilliant, he is. So I'm going to hand over to Tim and maybe Tim, if you could introduce yourself. Tim is a marine scientist and scuba diver. And if you are not a diver, I can see through the chat that there are quite a number of divers in this chat. I want to make it very clear that seagrass meadows are accessible for non-divers just as much. So we are going to hear from Ed Sheldon after Tim, who might have a bit more to say about shore-based intertidal surveys of seagrasses in Kerry, where he's based. And just before I do hand over to Tim, if you do have any questions, we're going to have a little Q&A at the end. Please drop them into the chat, and towards the end of the webinar, I'll go through those as they come in and direct them to Tim or Ed or myself, whoever it seems most appropriate. So Tim, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Alex. It's really interesting to see the work going on in the Mediterranean. Yeah, so my name's Tim Butter. I'm a scuba diver and snorkeler with Corks of Aqua Club. I studied marine biology back in the late 80s, and I work as an environmental scientist these days. I was also, up until January, on Forum Ushka, the National Water Forum, which is a policy body made up of stakeholder representatives. So I was the representative for the recreational use of our water resources. So we'll come back to a bit on policy actually towards the end, because things are moving quite quickly in that sphere in Ireland. So right, just okay. So just a kind of, I suppose, a fundamental of nature conservation is you basically need to know what you have and where it is. So what species do you have in your area? How many of them are there? Is there a common species or a rare species? And where are these individual species located? So this is kind of baseline information, baseline data that you absolutely have to have if you want to provide effective protection for any species or habitat. So Alex has been talking a little bit already about survey methods in the Mediterranean, but that's something we'll be kind of going back to in this presentation as well. Okay, so I always think if you're standing on the seashore and you're looking out to sea, you cannot see what's under the water. The surface of the water can reflect the light, and it's an absolute barrier preventing people on the shoreline to seeing what's underneath. Now, this is Oyster Haven, which is where our dive club boats are moored. And actually, where all those boats are moored at the forefront there's a quite substantial seagrass meadow. But just by looking at the sea, you would have absolutely no idea it's there. So I think divers, I guess, are very fortunate in that they get to go underneath the surface and actually see what's there. And I think a lot of divers, from my experience, are becoming more interested in finding ways they can add to the diving by protecting the habitats and species that they enjoy seeing when they're diving. And I think we also probably have an idea that we've just seen lovely photographs from the Mediterranean from Alex there, but maybe there's a kind of an idea that our marine life isn't anywhere like that. But the truth is we have extraordinary marine life in Ireland, from colourful sea anemones through to the second largest fish in the world, the enormous basking shark. So we've got huge potential marine life in Ireland, and I think it's really important that people get to appreciate it. And hopefully this project, as Alex has said, incorporating citizen science and art will help to give a better appreciation for people about what kind of amazing things we have in our coastal waters. So that's Dive Club boats. Again, that's Oyster Haven, which is where our study site is. So we're a fairly large club by Irish standards, I suppose. And we have our boats moored out there from sort of April to October every year. So as well as being our mooring site for the dive club, it's also where we do a lot of training. So we do shore dives from the slip here. You can see the slip on the left-hand side, and take trainees out to kind of where those boys are out in the picture here. And because we've been doing these dives, shore dives all the time, we knew there was seagrass there. So when it was kind of suggested that maybe we should do some sort of project some sort of conservation decks to kind of as well. Seagrass has incredible potential for carbon sequestration. It takes up huge amounts of atmospheric carbon. Very high. They can also protect coastal shorelines from circuses. That's why we'd be interested in seagrass. So this photo is an aerial photo of Oyster Haven. So I'm just admitting somebody to the meeting there. It's an aerial photograph of Oyster Haven, which I'll be using in a minute just to explain some of our methods that we use for monitoring the seagrass. But it's also quite a good photograph for showing some of the threats that there are to seagrass in Ireland. So first of all, we have, as you can see, the moorings, the boats. Each of those will have a concrete block with a chain attached to it, with a rope then going up to the boat with a buoy. So what tends to happen is, as the wind changes direction, the boats move around in an arc, and that chain gets dragged across the seabed, which will basically tear up all the seagrass in a circle around each mooring point. So one thing I certainly like to do, we haven't started doing it yet, is to try and use seagrass friendly moorings, but that's certainly a project for this year, later this year. You can also see that the land is surrounded by agricultural land. You've got a kind of bright green field on the right-hand side and a field up to the back left, which has been cut. So you've got potential for agricultural runoff of nutrients, which can enhance the nutrient content of the seawater, causing a process we call eutrophication, which is excessive plant growth. You also therefore, sorry, in this one, you can see there's lots of houses there. Each one has a wastewater treatment unit. There's a small village, so there's no centralized system. Each house has its own septic tank, and again, that can add to nutrient loadings in the water. And then where you do have kind of municipal wastewater treatment plants, they can also be, although they'll be licensed and would have controls on discharges, they will still be allowing material with enhanced nitrogen and phosphorus into the water. And then the last thing then is, and it certainly happened in Oyster Haven, is we've had boats coming in, small inshore boats fishing for sprats, so drawing nets through the water to catch fish. And it hasn't happened here, but potentially scallop dredging can be a problem as well. So you get big heavy metal nets being dragged across the seabed, which again will just rip up all the seagrass. So we've been monitoring the seagrass here for about the last 2 years. This will be the 3rd year, with an overall objective to establish baseline data relating to the health of the seagrass bed. So we've been doing a number of different kind of projects. The first one, which I'm going to talk about then, is a transect. So basically, we've chosen 2 fixed points, which are the 2 fixed mooring buoys, because they're attached, as I said, they're attached to a fixed mooring. We take down, divers go down at one end with a tape measure, take it across to the other end, and so it's a 50-meter transect. So if you can imagine, that's being laid underwater. It's like an ordinary surveying measuring tape, and we have this metal square, a quadrat, and every 4 meters, put down the quadrat and count the number of plants within that square. So fairly simple, but it gives a measurement of the plant density in number of plants per meter squared. Just gives a very basic, very simple, but basic raw data to start working with. Another thing we use is a Secchi disc. So this is a specially made device for measuring the transparency, or divers would say visibility, of the water. So you have this black and white disc on a piece of string, and on the string you've got those blue and red marks are marking 50 centimeter and 1 meter marks. So you drop the disc over the side of a boat, allow it to sink until you can't see it. You make a note then of what the depth is, using, because you've got a marked tape, and then bring it back up again until you can see it. and then take the depth again. So you're using, it's a fairly arbitrary method, but it is standardized. So you get an idea of the secchi depth visibility. So it gives an idea of how clear the water, because as we know, seagrasses aren't seaweeds, but they are plants, so they need light to photosynthesize. So the other thing we've been trying to do is actually map out our seagrass beds. Now, again, Ed will be talking about how you do this on seashore, where it's quite straightforward. You can just walk along the seashore with the GPS, and you can mark where your seagrass is. In Ireland, the seagrass we're working on is Zostera marina, which occurs from around about 2 meters below low water mark down to about 5 meters. It's fairly much more restricted depth-wise. But quite often the visibility in Ireland is less than 2 meters, which means you can't see the seagrass from the surface. But what we've been doing is on reasonably clear days, we have a team of 2 snorkelers with a handheld GPS, one on the surface with the GPS, and the other doing a duck dive, kind of straight down to check that seagrass is underneath. I mean, it looks in this photograph, you've got those dark areas, which you would think is seagrass. It's actually much more difficult to see it when you're in the water. It's the drone footage here makes it quite clear, but this method at least allows us to kind of accurately measure the outside perimeter of the seagrass bed, upload it onto a GIS mapping system, and then we can work out the extent area of the seagrass, and then we can compare that year on year to see if the bed is expanding or contracting or staying stable. And that's the kind of data we would generate from that activity. So that's the slip here is at the bottom, which we saw in one of the first photographs there with the dive club boat, and you can see the extent of the seagrass bed out to sea. That was one of the earlier efforts. I think we've kind of fine-tuned the plotting a bit, but it gives you an idea of the kind of thing you can generate. And you can see it's got an area there, 5,217 meters squared of seagrass. And then, oh yes, so satellite photographs can be used as well to kind of certainly give an indication of where seagrass might be occurring. So in this particular photograph, the circle in the top right is our main site in Oyster Haven, next to the slip there, which you can just about see. There on the top left, we saw in the aerial photographs, Google Earth photographs, looked like the dark colouring we thought might be seagrass, but it's not an area we'd ever really dived because it's actually quite a distance away from our main site. But it actually turns out to be seagrass. So we've started examining that site for various reasons, a bit more challenging than our first site. And then we also found another bed just to the south, which we've also started to measure and monitor. So, and then the next thing then is we've been measuring biodiversity. So there's a methodology developed by Sea Search, which provides basically training for recreational divers to record high quality marine biodiversity data. So we're basically using this methodology as our basis. The records generated are submitted via Sea Search to the National Biodiversity Data Centre. So their biodiversity records are freely available to anybody who wants to see them. But it's a reasonably straightforward methodology. Like a training course for Sea Search is normally a two-day course. You do 1 day of theory and another day of practical work out in the field. Because a little bit of form filling, because you need unfortunately need the forms, because that's how the data ends up becoming available to people. So I'm just going to go through a few photos of kind of typical marine life that we would see on the seagrass surveys. So the sea anemones here, the bottom left is a snake-locked sea anemone, which is a very typical species on Irish seagrass beds. The one on the right is a burrowing sea anemone, which again that isn't in a seagrass bed, but they're very common in seagrass beds. And I think the highlight of our year so far is a little sea anemone in the top left. It's called Halcampa, which we found in Oyster Haven. There's only about a dozen Irish records for it, so we're pretty pleased to get that one. We've got plenty of crustaceans. So these are all pretty common. The top left is a common prawn. The bottom left is a hermit crab. The bottom right is a lobster. And I think probably quite important to note that seagrass beds are very important for commercial species. Again, Alex has talked about this in the Mediterranean. They often act as nursery areas, the seagrass beds, for commercially important species. But you'd often see fish of commercial importance and shellfish. So obviously lobsters would be one of those. But things like lots of flatfish, codling in winter, red mullet, that kind of thing. The little spider crab in the centre, I'd say, is probably another kind of keystone species of our Irish seagrass beds, long-legged spider crab. So a very small species, body is only maybe 1 or 2 centimeters across, but with a huge, long, spidery legs. They quite often put bits of seaweed on their back to make them very, to add to their camouflage and makes them very difficult to spot. Mollusks. So again, bivalve mollusks, we've been talking about them already. So there's a cockle in the bottom right-hand corner. The central image is a netted dog whelk. So it's a gastropod mollusk, similar to kind of land snails. And then the orange-looking thing on the left is a nudibranch. So this is a sea slug. And that particular species appears to be nationally quite rare, but we get it quite frequently in the seagrass at Oyster Haven. Doesn't have a common name, I'm afraid. Okay, and then fish. So again, we've got a couple of commercially important species there. The top right is a red mullet, and the bottom left is a plaice. And then the other two would again be real characteristic species of seagrass beds. So the bottom right is a sea stickleback, which lives in weedy places, but really likes seagrass. And then the top left is a pipefish. It's a broad-nosed pipefish. There are around about half a dozen species of pipefish in Irish waters, and almost all of them can be found in seagrass beds. As you can see, I mean, although it's very, very brightly coloured, it is green and looks like a piece of seagrass, so they're pretty well camouflaged. A few more. So bottom left there is a goby. It's a black goby. There are lots of different species of goby, and again, many of them are very common in seagrass beds. The top left is a lesser spotted cat shark, or what we used to call a dogfish. And then the strange looking thing on the right is an armoured bullhead, or a poggy, which again we find quite commonly on seagrass beds. And another fan worm, a bit like the spirograph in the Mediterranean. This is our version called a peacock worm. So really beautiful, delicate array of feeding tentacles. And it's a worm. Okay, so I think it's just, seeing some of the stuff that we've been doing, just to make people aware that there are funding streams available to support these kind of projects. So the two that we've been using are from the National Parks and Wildlife Service. They're which should be coming out very soon, actually, is they have a fund for small projects for recording biodiversity, up to about €5,000. And then LawPro, which is a local authority water program, who will do more general environmental projects. And one of the things with LawPro is that their remit is to cover projects within the Water Framework Directive, which is to do with surface water quality, but people generally get fixated that it's to do with rivers and streams. It also includes estuarine waters and coastal waters out to 1 nautical mile, I think. So almost every single coastal project could be funded by LawPro, and I think it's something that would be useful for projects like this. And they can provide funding towards things such as boat maintenance, insurance, airfills, and specialist survey equipment. So, for example, the surveying tapes and the quadrats would have been bought as part of these grants. And then just coming briefly back to policy, this will be the last kind of section really, is that the Marine Protected Areas Bill is currently passing through the Oireachtas. The anticipation is it be enacted in Q2 of 2024, so sometime in the next 3 months. It's very ambitious. It seeks to protect 30% of Ireland's marine area by 2030. And as far as we can tell, seagrass is going to be included as a protected species and habitat within that bill, because currently it's not directly protected under the EU laws which are in operation. But coming back to my first point, really, we need to know how much seagrass we have, where it is, in order for protection to be effective. So that's where citizen science projects are really going to be very, very important in this area. And just to finally say a big thank you to my colleagues at Corkshire Aqua Club, who've been brilliant with these projects over the last couple of years, Local Authority Waters Programme, and NPW as part of the Department of Culture and Heritage. So that's it. Thank you.
And thank you, Tim. That was absolutely fantastic, and a bit more of a local look at endeavours that are going on down in Cork. I think that Tim and I have really looked at some of the I guess detail of being under the water, and what you can kind of gather from that sort of perspective. But a lot of people don't have that kind of access, and there are other ways of studying seagrasses that I'm now going to ask Ed to give us a little introduction to, and some of the work that he's been doing, which is going to be going up to Kerry now. And so, Ed, if you would be able to share your screen and bring up your slides, that would be great. And in the meantime, I'd just like to ask if anyone has any questions for Tim or Ed or myself that you'd like to ask, just please drop them into the chat. And we are getting shorter on time, but at the end, if there's a little bit of time, we can ask those questions. So without too much ado, Ed, if you're all ready, I'll hand over to you, and you can introduce some of the work you've been doing in Kerry.
Thanks, Alex. I gotta say, I've got great admiration for you for being the communicator in the crowds. I think what you're doing with shifting tides and some of the wonderful concepts you have is super important. Our group is very new. We only started in 2021. We had a sand dune that was breached, and we found out that seagrass bed was an important
Okay.
it prevented the destruction of our tombola, which you can see here in the lower left corner. So when somebody from Coast Watch and Kevin Lynch from the University of Galway came down, he said, look, if you have seagrass, it's going to dampen the amount of energy coming onto the coast. And we actually have it on both sides. We have Warfield grass on the Barrow Harbor side, and deeper, we have Zostera marina, which is the subtidal seagrass. So after we found out that seagrass was something of interest, we started using very simple techniques to measure the density. This is Zostera nulti, which you'd find intertidal. People commonly refer to it as just Warfield grass. And we found that we could do fairly accurate surveys, not only using stand-up paddle boards, like you can see in a couple of the pictures, but even just swimming. We could look at the lighthouse and get a rough idea of what the boundaries were. We could take a kayak out. We could, like you can't hardly see in this picture, but this is somebody with a bathyscope, and they could just put their glass and look through the top and see an amazing amount of things, especially at the low tide. So 2021, there we go. So I think in 2021, we started to do some really rough mapping. In 2022, we got a national park grant as well that allow us to buy a microscope to allow us to look at some of the smaller critters that we began noticing, looking at the growth on the seagrass. And we got very good at mapping, in fairness. The detail of our mapping improved significantly. We started towing buoys behind us when we were snorkeling. And like Tim was saying, we could just ride a bicycle along a lot of the places, when it's intertidal. For national biodiversity studies, yeah, they actually work with 100-meter by 100-meter squares. So what we're doing right now is we're just taking a sample and a photo every 100 meters and submitting that to have a record in the National Biodiversity Data Center of where intertidal seagrass is. But there's tools out there that are absolutely free. This is Google Maps, this is Google Earth Pro. Both of them are very easy to use. Our year-on-year studies allowed us to determine there was very little change in some places. And in other places, we discovered that there was significant change. For example, this is Barrow Harbor, and we have Brent geese that eat it here. And it'll shrink over the winter from about to a quarter of its original size, and it will be almost totally eaten by the Brent geese. But over the summer, it grows again. So seagrasses provides, a lot of food stock for our local wintering over birds here in Cary. In 2023, we were sponsored by the National Aquarium. I think they gave us €1,000, and I think their grants are coming out right now if you're interested. But they're looking for marine type of proposals, and ours was a 4-community group proposal. It was kind of unique because normally subtidal seagrass requires you to get into the water, which is a real insurance problem for our group in particular. So what we did is we found this by hand. It was a rock pool that every day you could walk around the edge of it. And so we got to see just an enormous amount of species by looking in, from the side. We tried to avoid stepping into the seagrass bed because we didn't want to disturb it. But this right here, just above the ruler, gives you an idea of how seagrass is self-forming. It's a habitat-forming species, I guess is the way they express it. The seagrass has been ripped off to the normal bottom, which is a very rocky, lots of stones in there. So for this to have occurred in about a 7-centimeter layer, which is going from this real sandy stuff through all the roots of the seagrass, and then somehow catching a hold of the bare rock, the small bunches of stones that are there, and to keep that in place when there's crashing waves coming down shows you the power of how dense and resilient seagrass is. And this is where all the blue carbon is stored, is in this layer and in the roots. So that's very sweet stuff, really sugary, and that's why it's so powerful in terms of the number of car equivalents that can occur. Maybe not in this particular seagrass bed, but like in other areas, you can get it to be meters deep, and then it forms a long-term, over hundreds of years, it accumulates, and it's really cool. But for us, I think the sea hares that we saw in this particular seagrass bed were just fabulous. I think on this particular day, it was the first day that all 4 groups went out together, and we saw 20 sea hares, and they just caught everybody's imagination. And it was great fun seeing in detail what we could find in the seagrass bed. I think a lot of people, you might be doing 50-meter transects. We just asked everybody, we asked everybody to do a 5-centimeter by 5-centimeter square once a month and just learn everything you could about that one small little area. So that was our goal for our group. And what did we come up with? Well, one of our goals was to look at the flowering bits of the seagrass. This is the male pollen being released into the water column, and you can see that the little strings of the pollen are going to be caught on the female flowers, which unfortunately I don't have a picture of, but these are various different stages and abnormalities that we saw, animals that were eating the seagrass until finally they got ripe. And those are the seas just before dissemination. We found some really mysterious things, like this is a tube that something lives in. It's about 3 millimeters wide by about a centimeter and a half long. And these guys had some kind of antennas coming off of them, but we still haven't figured out exactly what was living in them. So that was one of the mysteries we didn't solve. But we certainly took pictures of lots of different varieties of sea life, lots of worms, lots of nudibranch, crabs, the sea stars. It's really amazing if you look in detail. The more you look, the more you see. It's fascinating. We worked with a lot of different groups. Sea Search was who we worked with when we were diving, when we were snorkeling. We worked with Coast Watch to a certain extent for some of the intertidal stuff. We learned a great deal going to the Fair Seas conferences and learning about how legislation can it's upcoming in the Irish context of marine protected areas. We have a hope spot down here in Kerry, which we hope to promote. And we ended up doing stuff with the Smithsonian Institute. They gave us lots of support. They came over for a visit last year. We just found that working with so many groups was just an eye opener, and it all led to something I think really positive as well. And that's that the areas that you see in orange over here in the right-hand map, they're the oyster production areas in Tralee Bay. So we have the Tralee Bay Oyster Society here, and this is where they do their oyster farming. They've decided to voluntarily take areas that are indicated roughly in these areas that are in pan, and they're protecting them so that the seagrass will be protected, and they're going to try to do oyster restoration with the hope that if natural oysters can reestablish themselves as they grow older and have more natural habitat, that the whole area will be resilient and there'll be more whatever you want to call it, the baby oysters that are going to be released by the millions that can occur in longer established oyster beds, as well as protecting the seagrass. So that was implemented this year, and it really made our days, I guess, So what else can I say? We've got lots of support from so many different groups, like the Meharries Conservation Association were marvelous. Sea Search has been fantastic as well. So I guess that's what I really wanted to say, except that I'd like to point out one other thing that was really invaluable to us. If I can just switch out. Okay, here we go. One of the other things that we used really effectively was this application called iNaturalist. And just to give you an idea, this is the study area of the 4 coastal communities that we could just walk out into this area at low tide. So this is down here in Kerry. This is Killarney, Kerry. That's the site. And this is a group of animals that we spotted, very similar to 10 species. We saw sea squirts, and we saw lots of anemones and urchins, crabs, and nudibranch, various different types of shrimps. And just coming to look at things in details, like this would be maybe several hundred animals living on a piece of kelp. It really was an amazing experience for somebody that's never seen these things, and to get your head under the water, to observe it from the side of the bed. It's just an amazing experience, and I wish you guys the best of luck. Okay, well, can I just leave it at that? Is that okay, Alex?
Thank you.
All right.
That's perfect. Absolutely brilliant. And I guess that gives, like, the iNaturalist program is an example of something where people can get engaged quite easily without too much work. You don't need a scuba tank on your back, and there are lots of other opportunities to get involved. If seagrass isn't something, if we haven't managed to totally enthuse people about seagrass, there are plenty of other habitat types and creatures to study. I've dropped a few examples there into the chat of different surveys and programs that people can get involved in. And we want to bring more of these through the Shifting Tides project as well, to open up access to those. So I hope that this evening has kind of been a good introduction as we start to go into some more specifics of marine life that we might find in Carlingford Lough and all around the island, indeed. And I think that something that sort of struck me from this evening is what Tim had to say about the sheen and reflection of that water, and how it kind of gives a slight misinterpretation of what's actually lying beneath it, and how many different forms of life there are down there. We often think of the tropics, coral reefs, tropical rainforests as the kind of exciting ecosystems of the world. But you know, this island used to be covered in temperate rainforests, and just to the same extent, our shores are rich with seagrass meadows, kelp forests, marl beds that are supporting a whole diversity of life. And we really want this webinar series to be able to introduce those. So as we come towards the end, I just want to point out that although it's not on the website yet, we do have the next webinar booked in, which is going to be on the 9th of April at the same time of 7:30. That's going to be with Dr. Catherine Schoenrock, looking at kelp forests. Now you can see that the person who's organizing the webinars happens to have an enthusiasm for seagrasses and kelps and seaweeds. So if there are other topics that you'd be really interested in looking at, please do send us a message on our social media or by email if there are any topics you'd like us to look at. And we will be bringing more of these webinars in soon. So keep an eye on your inboxes for more updates coming from the Shifting Tides project. If you haven't yet filled it out, go on the Shifting Tides website, which is theshiftingtides.org, and you can fill out the expression of interest form there. You'll be able to get updates about what we're doing. If you are a diver and would like to take part in our Sea Search Observer course in July, keep an eye out for that as well. It will be taking place in Carlingford Lough, and there will be more events coming up as we go through this year and indeed the following year. So I think we'll leave it at that.
You have two questions in the chat, Attic, so if you've got time for them. One question was, do eelgrasses grow in Carlingford Lough? And another question is, what depth does seagrass go best, or is it light dependent? And what is the what impact might coastal energy sites have and their impact on seagrass? Now, those are like, maybe you could just do those very quickly, because I'm conscious people have stayed with us and we're just time to wrap up. But thank you so much. It's been brilliant, our speakers. So, and thank you for participants who stay in the course. So any quick answers to those, any of the speakers, yourself or anyone else?
So the first question from Richard is, do eelgrasses grow in Carlingford Lough? The short answer I have is yes, and I have this on, there are two sources really this has come from. Firstly, Ed, and I have been looking at historical maps of research that has taken place in Carlingford Lough, which does show the presence of seagrass meadows that have been recorded. Also, if there are any divers here who have been diving in Carlingford Lough, I don't know if you have any sightings that you'd be able to indicate. Actually, Ed has just pulled up a map. So we have possible locations of seagrass here in and around Carlingford itself. And I see that there are a couple of
But remember that this is historical.
Yeah,
okay.
Mill Bay on the North Shore. I know that there has been research done by PhD researcher Queens in Mill Bay, and we're speaking with them about trying to locate seagrass meadows on the North Shore. So there we go. Ed is a mapping guru and has a great number of insights into how to actually map seagrass meadows, as he's already given an introduction to. When Ed was first introduced to me, he was the guy who snorkels with a GPS on his back. So the second question we have, what depth does seagrass grow best? Is it light dependent, the impact of coastal wind energy? Tim, would you have maybe a bit more of something to say on that? You were talking about your SETI disc and the impact of the turbidity of the water that it might have. And I guess that has some impact, but depth as well, because light penetrates through water and then gradually dissipates and disappears and is absorbed. So would you be able to answer that one?
Yeah, so obviously you have two species. The Nolteus intertidal, the Marina, Dostal Marina, the subtidal one, in my experience, is pretty narrow band from about 2 meters to maybe 6 meters below low tide mark. It's the one in the Mediterranean goes down to 40 meters because you've got much better light penetration. But in Irish waters, I think you're talking about a very narrow band. In terms of coastal wind energy sites, I mean, the actual turbines themselves are going to be in deep water, way beyond seagrass. Issues could arise where you've got cables and shipping associated with the projects coming in and out of estuaries, that kind of thing. That would be where there could be conflicts of interest, I think.
I'm familiar with a project that went on in Spain where a cable laying company actually paid for a whole load of seagrass restoration, and it was one of these sort of offset projects. The idea was that they were going to offset the damage that they were going to do. I suppose if the cable was going to be laid anyway, it was a good thing to do, but I would kind of say, well, try and avoid damaging the seagrass in the first place.
Yeah, actually, I'll come back to very quickly, actually. Sorry, it looks like seagrass is going to get protection under the Marine Protection Bill. So that should help in terms of how planning goes ahead with these kind of projects in the future. Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And just on depth, the deepest that I've heard of was a PhD that was done back in '84. His deepest was right in here, and he had it down to about 12 meters. So
okay,
that's the deepest known in Ireland, to the best of my knowledge. Okay.
And the comparison between the Mediterranean and Ireland isn't necessarily something like the water quality is better or worse. They're very, very different water types in the Mediterranean. There's a lot less nutrients in the water. There's a lot less particles. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the water is better or anything like that. It's just a very different situation.
Ventry Harbor is it's got some of the best water in terms of clarity. It's probably the reason it is so deep there, to be honest with you. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think we have to wrap it up there. We were trying to cut it up to an hour, but obviously seagrass is such an intriguing topic that we've run over to an hour and 10 minutes. So thank you to Ed and to Tim for your contributions this evening. They've been absolutely invaluable. I hope everyone's found it somewhat inspirational, interesting. We hope that you'll keep on following the project, coming to these kinds of events, because your attendance at them is what really makes them what they are. So thank you all for joining. Please keep on following us, keep in touch. Susie, if there's anything else that I've missed, please let me know.
No, absolutely great. Thanks very much to everyone.
Evening and a great Easter weekend.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not quite warm enough, but if you're feeling brave, get in the water and see if you can find some seagrass.
Thanks very much, and good night, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.